Welcome to the Workers' Reading Room. Today I'll be reading 8 Pieces of Empire, a 20-year journey through the Soviet collapse by Lawrence Scott Sheets. This is Part 2, 1992 to 1996. Georgia, Anarchy in Paradise. My boss from Reuters TV says, "Pack your bags and get to Georgia." It is August 1992, and I've been working in Moscow in the 8 months since the USSR's disintegration. There's another war on there, this time in Abkhazia, Georgia. I've been to Georgia twice, most recently earlier that year after a 2-week civil war reduced the heart of the capital to a smoking ruin. I'd only covered one war, a few months earlier, and even then for only a few days, in the former Soviet Republic of Moldova. For some reason, this made me a kind of war specialist to my boss, or at least foolhardy enough to embark on this latest Georgian adventure. The 2-hour flight from Moscow south to the Caucasus Mountains reflects the now-dead empire's geographical complexity. Flat fields of wheat punctuated by birch forests give way to bursting rivers and rolling hills. Just an hour or so out of Moscow, our plane starts to pass over lands conquered by the Cossacks in the 18th century, the traditional homelands of dozens of indigenous peoples, Ossetians, Ingush, Kabardins, and Chechens to name a few. Then rise the Caucasus Mountains, snow-capped, knife-sharp granite fingers sticking up out of the blue. Georgia comes into view. Georgia seemed an unlikely backdrop for failed state status. The Soviet Union's richest corner, Black Sea beaches, snow-covered mountain peaks, subtropical sunshine nurturing mandarin and tea groves and vineyards. It had a reputation for producing painters, ballerinas, and poets, bacchanalia and boundless hospitality. "Get rid of the Russians and we'll live off our wine and cognac," was a typical common refrain. Yet in another way, it was indeed a very likely place for trouble. It was a mix of the majority Georgians, autonomous republics, and corners dominated by ethnic minorities. And, given its bountiful attributes, Georgia was naturally coveted. Home to resorts owned by the Soviet military, political, and cultural elite. What's more, Georgia had been part of the Russian Empire far longer than the effective birth of the Soviet Empire in 1917. Georgia had entered Russia as a protectorate in the late 1700s, as its rulers of the time saw it as a chance to avert another threat from Persians, Turks, or Muslim raiders from the North Caucasus. It even shared Orthodox Christianity with the Russians. Georgia and Abkhazia, the most valued jewels in the empire's battered crown. The Abkhaz were, in fact, by the time of the empire's breakup, just 17% or so of the population of that region, fewer than 100,000 souls. They blamed a deliberate policy of assimilation led by Stalin and his henchman Lavrenti Beria on their decline. Beria was also a Georgian, or to be more precise, a Megrelian, a Georgian subethnos. The Georgians became 45%, the rest Abkhaz, Russians, Armenians, and a smattering of others. Tensions smoldered for years. The Abkhaz local parliament declared independence, and through a series of deadly miscues, the war was on. And so it was with beautiful Sakartvelo, the land of the Georgians, in their own, very non-Russian language. Independence had arrived, and I was suddenly sent there to record the pathology of upheaval that would ensue. Nobody started this war. Nobody started this war, stammered the woman manning the one phone in the parliamentary press department of the Republic of Georgia. It was disingenuous, of course. Somebody started it. Maybe she was just in denial. But she's partially correct. The war's commencement is anarchic, absurd, seemingly starting on a whim. A paramilitary gang, the National Guard, gets permission to enter a few miles into autonomous Abkhazia and guard passenger trains, which are being raided and robbed at will. Georgia has agreed with the local Abkhaz authorities on guarding the trains. How will the National Guard accomplish this act of ensuring safety? With tanks, among other toys. Tanks to guard passenger trains? Tanks were not part of the deal. It is absurd, of course, the sight of the tanks evoking deep fears in Abkhazia, helping ignite the war. Not to mention the fact that they are worthless for guarding passenger trains. Tengiz Kitovani is the pot-bellied leader of the National Guard. His mission supposedly has nothing to do with Abkhaz separatism. It's to prevent a wave of recent kidnappings. No one told Kitovani to crack down on Abkhazia, they say. No one gave the National Guard permission to enter any witch towns, just guard the railway. But someone took some pot shots at Kitovani's guys, and they fired back. Looting and excesses began. Alcohol and testosterone were also involved. Need I add that Tengiz Kitovani is a large canvas painter by trade? Did I mention that some Georgians accuse him of being a KGB agent sent in by the Russians to do a fifth column job? Kitovani's men ditched their railroad guarding mission and angrily marched into the regional capital, Sukhumi. The predictable wave of looting and revenge against some ethnic Abkhaz and other local non-Georgians ensues. The Abkhaz flee north for the coastal town of Gudauta, where they set up their own administration. It's a mere few days after the war's start. I wander the halls of the parliament and strike up a conversation with Eduard Shevardnadze, the effective head of state of the new Georgia. At the time, he is officially known as chairman of the state council. Later, he'd opt for the title of president. At this state in Georgia's statehood, Chevy has but one bodyguard, and security is almost non-existent. To many in the West, he's the man who ended the Cold War as Mikhail Gorbachev's Soviet foreign minister. He's on his way to a raucous parliamentary session. Shevardnadze smiles and rattles off a few platitudes to me about how there is still hope. In other words, it's not too late to stop the conflict in Abkhazia. Shevardnadze has problems. The head of state is clearly not calling the shots. He's not even formally commander-in-chief of the National Guard. The dim-witted loudmouth Kitovani is. Kitovani is one of the warlords who brought Shevardnadze back to Georgia as a fig leaf for their questionable legitimacy. Because they have the men and the guns, they are in control, at least for now. The Abkhaz don't buy it. They are convinced Shevardnadze's behind the war. Shevardnadze tries to reach Kitovani by phone or military radio. The rabble-rousing artisan Kitovani, once inside Abkhazia, even refuses several times to take phone calls from the head of state as he helps lead Georgia into its latest disaster. I wander down the street from the parliament. It's a molten August sky, as if dripping hot lead. Armed men are milling around in a downtown park near Tbilisi's central house of chess. The air is a simmering pot boiled over. These fighters belong to yet another parliamentary group, the Mekradioni Knights, and the chief knight is about to speak. His name is Jaba Ioseliani, and he is a smiling man with a dramatic aura. In the 67th year of his life, born 1926, Jaba, Georgian men, even presidents, are referred to by their first names, preceded by Batono, a term of respect roughly meaning sir. He is well preserved, dapperly dressed, he prefers bow ties, and armed with a deceptively warm smile. By age 66, most paramilitary leaders have well-established military careers. Jaba's, by contrast, is about 2 years old. He helped topple the erratic elected president, Giviad Gamsakhurdia, over the winter. Now he, together with a big canvas painter Kitovani, is the other main protagonist in Georgia's newest war against the Abkhaz. Life imitates art. Jaba's current official job description? Dramatist, playwright. An earlier job of Jaba's came as a student in Leningrad. In this case, a woman's finger was allegedly chopped off in order to make it easier to steal a ring she wore. Toss in a second jail stint for manslaughter, and all in all, Jaba earned more than 15 years in a Soviet-Russian prison before reclaiming his status as a dramaturge in Georgia, just when the place was falling apart, and now as a warlord. Hundreds of armed men have shown up to hear the great man, who is pontificating from a stage inside the House of Chess. The gathered are an eccentric lot, and they and the great man seem props in a grand show. Uniforms? The favorite dress code is a t-shirt and jeans, preferably baggy ones. Dark sunglasses worn day and night, sun or clouds, also seem obligatory. Oh, and make sure you bring your own Kalashnikov, or share one with a friend. Jabba's speech is a colorful rant about pride and honor, or at least his interpretation of such values. Loud chatting among the crowd of fighters drowns him out. Many are sprawled out between theater chairs. The rabble is non-stop, extemporaneous. Georgians have a habit of talking all at the same time, and this is no exception, especially since many of the knights are inebriated. The knights are accountable only to themselves, and, occasionally, Jabba, who is accountable to no one. They make sure everyone understands that. The license plates on their automobiles are uniquely personalized. Often they have none. Jabba jumps into a waiting car, followed by me and the makeshift army of men in cars with no license plates. The several hundred fighters head for the airport. The knights have no planes, and the government has no real air force, even troop transports. Odd aircraft on the tarmac, usually Tupolev 154s, the standard Soviet passenger planes, are commandeered on the spot and converted for use in minutes. The lucky get seats, if they haven't been torn out. No seat, no problem. Stand in the aisles, in the cockpit, in the toilet. Some men pile into the cargo hold along with a new supply of artillery shells. Everyone poses for pictures, partaking in this moment of history. Gemarjos Sakartvelos, long live Georgia. The empire is dead, and the pent-up emotions of hundreds of years of foreign tutelage boil over in a paroxysm of national fervor. The result is a ruinous, pointless, internecine bloodletting pitting Georgians against Ossetians, and now Georgians against Abkhazians, and finally Georgians against Georgians, during which most of the original objectives, such as independence, get lost in the mayhem. The knights have vague notions about their upcoming mission in Abkhazia. "We are going to fight for the motherland" is a typical refrain. Blank stares greet me when I ask what that means in practice. Well, it's only been going on for a week. So, is it really a war? Well, people have been killed, so let us call it a conflict, but not a war yet. We can reserve that designation for another year, by which time there will be 10,000 dead and hundreds of thousands homeless. I'm ready to make my way to the front, if there is one. Groups of Georgian fighters are still clamoring to get there too. Miraculously, some commercial flights are still flying. I buy a $12 ticket on a 26-year Yakovlev 40 plane. I seem to be the only paying passenger, however. The rest are either Batono Jabba the dramatist's knights or Kidovani's National Guardsmen. Why is it that paramilitary gurus around these parts all seem to be led by artists of one ilk or another? It is hot on the asphalt, burning hot. Shoes sink in the half-melted tar. The flight was supposed to leave at 3 p.m., but now it is 4, and then 5, then 6. "We're waiting for a VIP, blurts out an airport official. Who? No one will say. We take refuge from the heat by sitting on our bags underneath the wings of the little plane. 3 fighters are next to me, along with a lamb on a tether. They do their best to show me the legendary Georgian hospitality, pouring shot after shot of chacha, or hardcore Georgian moonshine made from grapes, into a common glass and down shot after shot. Sweaty with gregariousness, they act like they're going to a party, or a funeral pyre for the empire. They drink to my health, even as they slowly ruin theirs, and insist I join them in the festivities. But I'm in no mood for this and turn down their entreaties until someone reminds me that snubbing a toast is an offense to Georgian honor, an issue that is treated with infinitely more gravity than the newly ignited war. Finally, the pilot appears. After some 24 men with their sundry weapons board, I climb up the stairs followed by my 3 fighter friends and the lamb. It bleats and blaws the entire way to Abkhazia. So does one of the liquored-up fighters, chattering away in Georgian in my ear the whole flight, which I don't understand a lick of yet. That fact does not trouble him. It's dark by the time we land in Sukhumi, and I can't see a thing from the air. My fighter friends disappear with their bleeding future dinner into the chaos on the tarmac. As the reinforcements have arrived, other armed men fight for seats for their flight back to Tbilisi. Across the runway, a much larger passenger jet is getting ready to fly a scheduled route to Moscow. Most of the would-be passengers are Georgian men, dragging enormous bags filled with produce to sell in Russia. They make their way toward the plane, but are stopped by furious fighters who charge the merchants with desertion of the motherland. "Stay and fight," they scream at their perceived turncoats, firing their weapons in the air. The war that nobody started does not seem to be going well. I make my way through the throng to the road outside the terminal and try to find a lift into the city, some 12 miles away. There are no cars on the road. Another fighter approaches and introduces himself as Commander Dato, the Georgian short form of the name David. He is tall and his head droops toward me like an overripened sunflower. With him is his local woman Irina. "I'm a Jew," she says, out of the blue. For the next 2 hours, Dato talks up a storm. He's already called HQ, he says. Every so often, he promises a car is on the way. 10 minutes, he says for the 13th time. Later, instead of a 14th broken promise, he admits, "No more cars tonight," and points in the direction of a forlorn barracks-like shack. I stumble in the dark and enter. The floor is a mixture of concrete and dirt. A bunch of grunts snore away on cots. I find a free one and pretend to sleep. At dawn, I leave the slumbering paramilitaries and wander onto the long airport access road, which leads to the main highway. There are still no cars in sight, but the morning sun reveals a lush cover of palm trees, mandarin groves, and tea plantations along the main road. Cows wander through tea bushes. The Black Sea coast arcs on the left. On the right, the snow-capped peaks of the Caucasus. I'd heard of Abkhazia's beauty, but wasn't prepared for the Malibu at war I'd entered. A car stops along the road, another rattling, ubiquitous old Soviet Lada. The man behind the wheel is Alexander Burilava. He's wiry, edgy, with ruddy cheeks. Although he claims to be a local journalist, he's wearing military fatigues and is now doing PR for the Georgian war effort. "They had all the best houses, all the best jobs," Burilava complains, insisting the Abkhaz and the Russians started the war through a carefully calculated set of provocations. He pulls up to the Georgian HQ, hastily set up in a palatial coastal mansion in a lush botanical garden that once served as summer digs for Uncle Joe Stalin. Peacocks strut about the yard, barking. Placards identify rare plants and flowers. Visual and olfactory sedatives for Stalin and other strong men who've inhabited this piece of paradise. We ascend the steps, and I am led in and introduced to Georgy Kondrava, the city's military commandant. Just like Jabba the dramatist and the painter Kidavani, Georgy is yet another artistic figure, in this case, an actor by profession. The war is feeling more and more like a big stage production. Welcome to Sukhumi, my friend," crows Commandant Kondrava. He is boisterous, hosting, as if the mythology of Georgia's endless wine and feast-fueled bacchanalia is obligatory even in these difficult circumstances. I mentioned to Kondrava that the knights and guards have not ingratiated themselves with the local Abkhaz and non-Georgian population. They've accused them of looting, booze-fueled vandalism, and random violence. He nods his head slowly. This is a problem among his men, he admits. When the military commandant tells you he's got a problem with random violence and uncontrollable marauding, you know there's more trouble brewing. I ask about getting to the front. The problem is, there isn't much of one. Most of the Abkhaz have retreated to the north of the region and are busy setting up an army, with the covert help of the Russians and some allies from ethnic brethren in Russia. In the heady first days of the war, the Georgians demonstratively marched all the way up the coastal highway to the Russian border, planting Georgian flags, kissing the local women, and drinking with local men. But marking territory is not the same as holding on to it. 18 years later, in 2010, Georgy Karkarashvili, a young Georgian top commander in the Abkhaz War, who later became Georgia's defense minister at the ripe age of 26, makes a startling admission. "We entered Abkhazia in a very disorganized way. We didn't even have a specific goal, and we started looting villages along the way," Karkarashvili says. "As a result, in the span of a month, we managed to make enemies out of the entire local population." With such sage military planning, more driven by testosterone than strategy, the end result of the war that nobody started would be predictable. I arrived back at my apartment in Tbilisi from Abkhazia after midnight, covered in subtropical sweat and grime. Images of rare luxury swirl in my head, in this case of hot water. One of the few perks central planning did offer was non-stop, almost scalding tap water on demand. In urban USSR centers, one could take virtually endless free steam showers, the water pumped from giant central heating stations. Any American who grew up in a large family knows this is not something to be taken for granted. I went to the shower and turned it on, but the water was an icy rain. I waited, but the stream remained glacial. The central hot water system never was switched back on again in Georgia. Heating stations could no longer afford fuel, the end of another era. I get a late-night phone call from a colleague. Head of State Eduard Shevardnadze was flying to New York the next morning to speak at the United Nations. I assumed it was already too late to sign up. "Come to the airport and just get on," said the reporter, Zora Vardzalashvili. "What do you mean, just get on?" I countered. "We're talking about the president's plane, and he's leaving in a few hours." "Just show up," he said. Rules of deference and feigned respect common to the rest of the government world had yet to catch on. The Georgian officials were often embarrassingly deferential to foreigners. The guards at parliaments barely bothered to emerge from a slouch when I passed through. There were metal detectors for show, usually switched off. I got to the airport minutes before takeoff. Shevardnadze stands, waiting. The man who ended the Cold War seemed a bit out of place in the VIP lounge, with its stained brown carpeting and sofas with cigarette holes, where cows often wandered near the molehill bumpy runway. "Go ask him if you can come along," Zora told me. "He's the head of state. I can't just ask him like that," I said. Zora looked exasperated with my formality. He knew what he was doing, himself a former aide to Shevardnadze during communist times. Zora sauntered up, then whispered to Shevardnadze, who quickly flashed his Cheshire cat smile, sometimes described as warm by Westerners, but as Machiavellian by some Georgians, not to mention the Abkhaz. "Come along," Shevardnadze lip-synced. Chevy's plane was in effect making its maiden voyage as the most modern aircraft in the Georgian fleet. It had just been retrofitted with extended fuel tanks and other updates. After takeoff, Shevardnadze's personal stewardess took command of the in-flight program. She was a 25-year-old pop singer by the name of Anna Jackie. Anna had curly red hair and a petite body, and was well known for what by Georgian standards were her racy music videos. Her clothing was so tight it appeared to be sprayed on. Anna helped hand out the meals, which consisted of hand-sliced blobs of fatty beef on blanched, tasteless bread. The meat also turned out to be rancid. As a consequence, I spent 2 days in New York looking into a toilet bowl. We stopped for fuel in the Icelandic capital, Reykjavik. The city was wrapped in one of its legendary fog attacks. The runway appeared out of nowhere as the pilot tried to land. Unsurprisingly, we overshot it. The plane groaned as he violently jerked it back up and banked hard to the left, over the icy Atlantic below. We landed safely on a second attempt. By this time, however, the plane full of normally boisterous Georgians was shaken into silence. The Icelanders wheeled out their prime minister to meet with the man who ended the Cold War, Shevardnadze, now more a curiosity piece than statesman to the West, as if his plane were a UFO and those aboard it green men with antennae. The Icelanders hurried him and several of his ministers off to a meeting room, giving the diplomatic non-event, fuel stopover, an air of mysterious intrigue. The real fruits born of the first and possibly last Icelandic-Georgian summit remain a mystery to this day. Back on the presidential plane, nervous faces greeted us. A crew member agitatedly discussed something in the front. Anna, the pop star presidential stewardess, later revealed the reason for the commotion. The windshield of the plane had cracked in a spiderweb pattern. Aviation rules mandated that it be unconditionally grounded. The crack was a decompression risk, and we were about to head over the frigid Atlantic again. The irony that our intended path was similar to that of the Titanic, almost exactly 80 years later, was not lost on us. Shevardnadze had other ideas. "Fly on," he calmly told the pilots, after learning a replacement would have to be brought from Moscow, at least a 2-day delay, including repair time, which would have meant missing the UN session. There was only a small, low-level State Department retinue waiting on the tarmac when we landed at JFK. The Cold War was over. Shevardnadze's once tall standing carried a lot less coin. As we taxied in, broken windshield intact, a tiny retinue of unknown U.S. State Department officials waited below to greet him, a sea change from the red carpet treatment he was used to from world leaders as the Soviet foreign minister. Shevardnadze, who rarely took insult to heart, grunted something in disgust to an aide. Here was a global giant who had been confused with the leader of a third world country, which in fact he now was. Shevardnadze got a better reception at the United Nations, where he made an impassioned speech about the dangers of what he claimed was aggressive separatism in Abkhazia. However, some of the Georgian journalists and government officials on the trip never saw it. They skipped the protocol bit and busied themselves scouring the bowels of the Bronx for cut-rate TVs and stereos. Once we took off for Georgia a few days later, the man who ended the Cold War made his customary foray into the back of the aircraft to greet those aboard. He did a quick double-take, however. The rear half of the plane was jammed with boxes reading Sony, JVC, and Pioneer. They'd converted the presidential plane into a flying warehouse of cheap electronics. As the shop tour continued, the war in Abkhazia was escalating. Ceasefires had been signed and broken, the fighting escalating, the Georgians retreating. By late October, the Georgians controlled only the capital, Sukhumi, and a few lesser towns. Later that month, possibly as a burst of revenge or effort to wipe out the historical record of the Abkhazs' presence in the region, a group of Georgian fighters torched the building housing the Abkhaz Cultural Archives in Sukhumi, effectively destroying history. Saved were only a few thousand out of some 170,000 unique documents and artifacts. This greatly embittered the Abkhaz in a way that has never been forgotten. The war was now Shevardnadze's, even though he appears to have been opposed to launching it. He had gone from Berlin wall smasher to returning to power in his smallish, chaotic, but now independent Georgia. Shevardnadze's detractors in Moscow hated him for destroying the USSR, along with Gorbachev, by giving away East Germany. Now the man who helped bring down the empire was left trying to hold together the remnants of another fragmenting land, his native Georgia. Exodus. Autumn gave way to a winter and spring of pitched battles, the Georgians barely hanging on to Sukhumi. The war that nobody started was clearly not going according to plan, not that there had ever been a plan. As sultry summer set in, fighting periodically severed the only road link to the capital, cutting it off from the outside world. The Georgians launched bloody counteroffensives, reopening the meandering coastal highway for a few more days. Soon after, it would be sliced again, reopened and recut. The strangulation of a dying man, then easing up ever so slightly just as he loses consciousness, allowing mocking reprieves of oxygenated euphoria as the inevitable approaches. I, a few other reporters, and the odd aid worker stayed near the front lines, at a sprawling old facility built for Red Army bigwigs. Its official name was typically Soviet, the resort sanatorium of the Moscow Military District. Palatial digs by Soviet standards, the sanatorium sits amid 20 sensual acres of palms, orchids, and oleanders, a botanist's subtropical dream. It was the only place left to stay. Georgian units had commandeered the rest of the hotels, The Obkhaz had shelled others into disrepair. The sanatorium oozed with the air of empire, a coveted Kremlin colonial outpost. Russian generals had vacationed here for decades. You could feel their ghosts frolicking on the spacious balconies. The foamy waves of the Black Sea lapped onto the beaches below them. Most of the resort workers abdicated as the war intensified, leaving behind a crew of local caretakers. The gaggle of clerks, cooks, and cleaners had long been at the condescending beck and call of vacationing generals. Now, like a group of mutinous deckhands who'd thrown their sadistic captain overboard, they reveled in ironic revenge. There were almost no guests, no running water, and little food. Notoriously inaccurate missiles fired by the Obkhaz regularly scored direct hits on the sanatorium grounds, blasting out windows. The now ruling working class was oblivious to these inconveniences. The estate was theirs, and they relished it. One of the newly crowned was Marina, a chambermaid. A gregarious, wispy 50-something, Marina was permanently clad in homemade black ruffled skirts that reached her ankles, even in the most oppressive of sea humidity. She derived great joy from her newfound powers. Marina took special delight in one particular act, conferring the keys to rooms once reserved for the top Soviet military elite into hitherto unauthorized ruffians like me. Leading me to my room, Marina would dangle the keys suggestively from their carved wooden tags and then carefully glide them into the locks. With the weight of her small body behind her, she'd dramatically push open the doors to reveal my double-roomed chamber with 12-foot ceilings. There were large beds with ruffled spreads, Kich red velvet love seats, and amenities like the crystal water decanters that doubled as receptacles for my morning bird baths. The decanters were a godsend, for when I turned on the wheeled taps in the bathroom, usually nothing came out. At best, foul-smelling brown water trickled down. "General Ivanov once holidayed here for 2 weeks," Marina cackled. "I'll tell you something else. Comrade Belinsky's wife used to love to sleep in this bed, and not always alone," she giggled, placing the keys in my hands as if they were diamonds. Every evening as the sun was setting over the sea, at precisely 8 o'clock, the caretakers switched on a rumbling old diesel generator. The sanatorium became practically the only island of light in the darkened capital. The few of us who called the sanatorium home gathered nightly on the veranda. We drank from jugs of crude homemade wine and smoked the chokingly acrid local Abkhazian-produced cigarettes, Astra. With little else to do, we watched and listened to evenings of exploding artillery shells. We could often see blasts from a pier a few hundred meters away. The Abkhaz shelled it nightly. In the lush hills surrounding the city, firefights erupted in quick bursts. We traded vacuous interpretations about what was going on, trying to make sense of it all. It was a way to pass time, aided by bravado about the ongoing battles. Neither the Abkhaz nor the government shed much illumination on the situation. They bragged of astounding but non-existent battlefield triumphs. They underestimated their losses with equal shamelessness. Yes, one could visit the front, but that offered few real clues about what was going on. This was a war being fought mostly with random barrages. Both sides favored rockets whose nickname Grad means hail, as in a hailstorm. They were just as inaccurate as their name. During attacks, they rained on the besieged capital from truck-mounted batteries that could fire off a couple dozen of the treacherous things at a time. Grads were conceived by Soviet munitions designers to frighten incoming infantry, not for precision. The effect was, predictably, devastating. The attacks rarely hit anything strategic. Sometimes they simply decapitated innocent pedestrians brave enough to venture out for food or supplies. The Georgians would answer by firing the same inaccurate grads at the Abkhaz positions. From our nighttime perch on the veranda, we had a perfect view of the entire bay. It would have been possible to watch the movements of naval ships or patrol boats, except that neither side had a real navy. Life went on amid the bombardments. From my post along the veranda, I occasionally heard cries of passion wafting from rooms of the sanatorium. I wondered if it could be Marina. I wondered if she was gleefully taking revenge on the wives of those haughty military generals. They had sometimes vacationed at the sanatorium alone, away from their military husbands. Perhaps Marina was making the most of those oversized beds before the war took that away from her. More ceasefires came and went, and as missiles continued to rain down on the city, a silence descended. The wide avenues, lined by incongruously pastel buildings and botanical gardens, emptied by the day. Pedestrians deserted the promenade along the seafront, where ships full of tourists had docked just a summer before. The exodus began with the start of the war. Now it accelerated. It was a gradual march out of the capital, done stealthily, like a family facing eviction. Just as no one wants the neighbors to see the truck backing up at the door, the men who could have fought at the front did not want to be seen abandoning their city. They seemed to look away on their way out, avoiding eye contact. The streets streamed with women dragging bags, bright woven bags with stripes, full of family albums, heirlooms, and clothes. Bags became a main topic of discussion. Who was selling them, where to buy them, when more might arrive at the bazaar, which kinds were strongest and which would rip, which were the easiest to sling over one's shoulder, which ones were waterproof. Once the bags were filled, families would haul them to a curbside and wait for a passing bus to come, at least during times when the only road out was not cut by battles. The lucky drove out with their cars stacked high with belongings, but the preferred method of escape was through the airport. Of course, by now, scheduled passenger planes were no longer flying. People wanted out, not in. Getting onto one of the departing planes was a matter of persistence, luck, and social position. I had an unfair advantage. At the press center, a man handled getting journalists out of the capital. Alexander Kondrava was the uncle of Sukumi's military commandant, the actor Georgy Kondrava, whom I'd met on my first trip. A septuagenarian, Alexander projected the avuncular aura of a Southern college professor. He occupied a room in Stalin's summer retreat. As a young man, he'd grown up in China, in the city of Karbon, among a community of Soviet exiles who fled amid the Bolshevik Revolution. His king's English empowered him to deal with the press. Few other people around spoke English at all, and he delighted in me as a captive audience. Alexander Kondrava was a man shipwrecked by the shifting fortunes of empires in exile. This made a lonely soul of him, and so, instead of expediting my way out of the city, he impeded it. He pretended not to know when the next plane full of Georgian paramilitaries would land, making space for escapees. On an old plastic rotary phone, his long crinkled fingers dialed the numbers for the airport with excruciating slowness. He knew himself that the city's telephone lines were so bad that barely one call in 100 might get through. When Alexander did get through to the airport, he'd often say, beaming, "I'm so sorry, the plane just left." For him it was a reprieve that meant another hour of conversation over tea, 60 minutes less loneliness in a country that was his, yet not altogether his, in a war that was neither his nor anyone else's in particular. The airport, once I did reach it in spite of Alexander's gentleman's loneliness-laden chivalry, was a war zone of a different kind. When one of the planes would land, near riots ensued. Screaming women fought with the paramilitaries, themselves trying to escape. The fighters waved Kalashnikovs and barged their way into the planes. The power of their weapons determined who would get on. The battles were nonsensical. The planes landed and took off until everyone who wanted out was out. Then the fighting would die down again. Ethics held little sway. It was often women and children last. There was, however, one cardinal rule. The dead were given priority. In Georgia, the dead are more alive than the living. The culture enshrines a cult of funerals and wakes. Georgians, as well as Abkhaz and many in the Caucasus, feast around the graves of their departed every year on their birthdays. They leave succulent food, jugs of wine, and even cigarettes for the dead. The dead. They were stacked in simple zinc coffins and loaded onto the planes. Not military aircraft, just more requisitioned former Aeroflot passenger jets. A fighter with a clenched face guided me up the ladder and past the screaming women and shouting paramilitaries. The Georgian custom of chivalrous hospitality can reduce one to a state of embarrassment. This was, after all, a flying hearse, and I was jumping the line. Below the plane echoed the shrieks of women and yells of men, and the larger sense of noisy Georgian chaos of the time. But inside, those shimmering, clean, perfect zinc rectangles of coffins stacked high conferred a feeling of pedantic order. The fighter took me into the cockpit. The pilot was a thick-set man with a pencil mustache. He welcomed me in the same cheerful, oblivious Georgian spirit, as if I had walked into a wedding party, not a plane of rotting bodies. From the cockpit, the pilot watched nervously out the window as more people jammed aboard the plane. I tried to open the door to the cockpit to take a photo of the cabin, but it was so overloaded with coffins, refugees, and fighters that I had trouble pushing it open. The air was stifling, 100 degrees of sweltering humidity. His face turned from apprehension to anger. He looked at the weight indicator dial nervously. "We're overloaded by 30%. We've been flying regularly 20% overweight," he told me. "But 30 is pushing it. You see the condition this plane is in. The tires are bald. The fuel is of rotten quality. I think they've been watering it down." The pilot put on his headset and barked at the dispatcher. "We're not taking off. Do you want us all to die or something? We're overweight. Unload some of them or I'm not flying anywhere." No one budged. I could hear commotion coming from outside the cockpit. It swung open, and a fighter glared at the pilot, gripping his AK. "Start those damn engines or we'll bring another pilot and leave you here." The pilot swore and began going through the pre-flight checklist. Sweat accumulated on his forehead. The engines roared to life. We taxied to the runway and then went all the way back to the end of it, to give us as much length as possible to take off. The plane groaned and picked up speed. We hurled toward the end of the runway. We lifted off with only a few feet to spare. From the windshield, I watched the crowd of waiting women would-be escapees with their woven bags. They and the fighters left around them slowly faded from view. We passed over those bright mandarin groves full of wandering cows, derelict tea plantations, and the bougainvillea-lined main road along the beach. That misleadingly serene beach, devoid of holidaymakers, devoid of women in bikinis, devoid of children with sand pails and old men gathering shells. From the cabin the sound died. The shuddering craft was filled with the scent of sweat and death. The pilot wiped his brow. He aimed the plane in the direction of Tbilisi. He said we'd fly lower than normal to save fuel. I nodded as he told me the story I'd already heard hundreds of times. Georgians, he said, had not expected freedom to be so tough or so brutal. The pilot put the plane at cruising altitude and then performed his obligatory duties as a good Georgian host. "Now it's your turn," he said. He sat me down in the pilot's seat. I took my place at the controls. Tupolev 134s, now mostly obsolete, are low on automation. Therefore, many veteran pilots actually relish flying them, rather than running what is essentially a mainframe with wings. This one had an old-style transparent nose cone. I could see everything around, like a glass-bottom boat. The plane pitched slightly as I moved the controls. Crazy thoughts filled my head. If I turned too sharply, those neatly stacked zinc coffins would tip over and the corpses would spill out. If I aimed the nose down, we would descend into the aquamarine waves of the Black Sea. Then the pilot retook the controls as we reached the midpoint over the water. Tbilisi came into view and we began our descent. As we approached, he turned to me. "Friend, Do you know what happens when you try and land a plane that is this overweight? The pilot asked me. I did not, I said. When a plane is this heavy, it's very dangerous to put down. We could swerve off the runway. We could run out of runway. Or one of the tires could burst, and with all the extra weight, we might spin out of control and flip over. He seemed relieved to verbalize all the apocalyptic possibilities. I didn't ask any more questions. The wheels hit with a thud, and the plane bounced back up. The women jammed in the toilets and amid the coffins shrieked. The pilot gritted his teeth. We shuddered to a halt at the very end of the runway. A crowd of civilians and fighters surged along the sun-drenched route toward us, looking for relatives, dead and alive. Over the next few weeks, the Georgians were forced to consent to a peace plan to end the war in Abkhazia. As a condition, they agreed to pull out their military hardware, tanks, artillery pieces, and armored personnel carriers, APCs. But the truce would not last. Too much blood had been shed. Both sides accused the other of ceasefire violations. The Abkhaz, backed by the Russians, smelled victory. In late September, the Abkhaz again cut the main road. The provincial capital of Sukhumi was surrounded. The Georgians had little left to fight with. Again, Shevardnadze flew to the city to rally his troops. The next day, I followed his path in another converted passenger jet. It was, as usual, stuffed to the hilt with ammo. The pilot of this plane also told me to ride in front with him. If we take fire on our approach, the cockpit is the safest place to be, he explained, not so reassuringly. Sure enough, as we approached the city, we saw a gunboat in the harbor. It was one of the small vessels the Abkhaz had rigged up with crude anti-aircraft missiles. The pilot pointed at the boat below, like a warped tour guide. He banked hard left as an evasive maneuver. Again, we landed hard. It was a relief, as if being delivered to a doomed city can be called that. Ours would be one of the last Georgian planes to ever land in the city. I headed back to the sanatorium with a group of Georgian fighters. More Russian officers had arrived. They were there as monitors for the now doomed peace deal. In reality, Russia had sided with the Abkhaz. For the Abkhaz, alliance with the Russians was pragmatism. The Russians helped arm and train them. This was openly admitted to me later by top-level Russian military officers in Abkhazia. For the Russians, a part of the reasoning was cultural, the Abkhaz being perceived by the Russians as more Russified. But mostly it was strategic. Abkhazia had excellent military facilities, resorts for the Soviet military brass, and seaports. Add to that the Kremlin's hatred toward Shevardnadze for his role in destroying the Soviet Union as Mikhail Gorbachev's foreign minister. Some of them were out to return the favor by helping to, as they saw it, destroy Shevardnadze and shatter Georgia in its own fragmented state. The world had responded to the crisis by sending a tiny team of 8 United Nations observers and their Danish commander, Brigadier General Hvidegard, all of whom had also taken up residence at the sanatorium. They were powerless to do anything. Condemned cities are repositories of the poor, the foolhardy, and the naive. They are also sanctuary to the eccentric and the twisted. I now found myself sharing a room with Ed Parker, a sinewy, excited Brit. His jerky body movements and taped-up wire-rimmed glasses infused him with the aura of an unhinged chemistry buff. Parker had arrived in the capital as a fixer for a British TV crew, ITV. The telecrew stayed one day and then hurriedly flew off on one of the last planes out. But Parker stayed behind. He told the TV crew to go to hell, even though he had no outlet to report to and no means of filing news. He stayed out of ghoulish interest, a war tourist. Ed told me he had fought as a mercenary on the Croatian side during the war in Bosnia. Did you kill anyone? I asked. Hell, everyone asked me that question. Okay, man, yeah, I killed some guys. There were a bunch of Serbs in a truck. We saw them over a ridge and blasted them with a bazooka. Don't ask me that fucking question again. Ed relished his apocalyptic situation. When I got here, I was determined to be the last one out, he told me proudly. Then there was the preacher man. I found him wandering amid the palm tree-lined grounds of the sanatorium with an accordion slung around his neck, a proselytizer from the southern United States. He spent his time wandering around various post-Soviet war zones, trying to save the souls of those about to enter the other realm. He had a serene twinkle in his eye, probably because he sensed he had plenty of work ahead. The preacher man had just done something even the most adrenaline-crazed war junkies hadn't. He'd walked across the front lines as Georgian and Abkhaz shells crashed down around him. I told him it was a damn fool thing to do. Suicidal. The preacher man just shrugged. "You never know when you're going to meet your maker," he said with a big grin. Then he raised his elbow and mashed his fist into the side of the accordion. His folksy voice and the accordion's toyish vibes seemed to echo in unison along with the swaying tops of the palm trees. All-consuming fire, you're my heart's desire, and I love you dearly, dearly, Lord. Glory to the Lamb. I exalt the great I Am. The preacher man continued with his Armageddon talk. He'd spent several days with the Abkhaz on the other side of the front. They told him the final assault on the city would come soon. The end would come in a few days. Of that he assured me. Later, the preacher man's information would prove to be more accurate than that of any pontificating journalist or the UN observers, who were observing almost nothing, having just arrived a few days and weeks earlier and being confined to their quarters by the bombardments. The Georgian defense of the city was quixotic. They had virtually no heavy armor left, save about a dozen rusting T-55 tanks of 1960s vintage. The covers to most of their artillery pieces were locked as part of the collapsed ceasefire, and they said the mediating Russians refused to provide the keys to unlock them. They were down to a few howitzers. 2 Georgian volunteers with soot-black hands did man one old artillery gun. They set it up on a jetty, just behind us and the sanatorium. We were now in the direct path of direct artillery barrages from Abkhaz positions. Dozens of boxes of ammunition were stacked up around the aging gun on our side. The Georgians took turns firing toward the front. The Abkhaz and their allies blasted back. But since they were using equally inaccurate firepower, many of the shells just exploded on the ground of the sanatorium, blasting out our windows and scaring the few remaining residents to death. Moreover, the Georgians were not bothering to change the location of the gun every few hours, as military logic demands. They blasted away, violating the cardinal rule governing artillery. Many of the Georgians had almost no weapons training. I saw one confused fighter struggling to jam his Soviet-made AK with ammo made for Romanian or other ex-East Bloc AKs, which can cause the guns to jam and explode. I didn't hang around to see the outcome. General Hvidegard, the UN man, sat on his balcony, smoked a cigarette, and philosophized over the shrill whistling of the gun. He said there had been negotiations to save the peace deal. But in the typical bravado of so many wars, the sticking point was the ownership of a dozen or so AKs. The guns had belonged to the Georgian Abkhaz Russian Commission monitoring the ceasefire. The Abkhaz and the Georgians were bickering over their ownership. The sides insist this is a matter of honor. Unfortunately, this is the level we are dealing with, Hvidegard told me. On the jetty behind the sanatorium, the lone howitzer kept blasting away. That gun's been firing every 45 seconds for the last 3 days, the general said nonchalantly. It can't continue forever. Either they will run out of ammunition, or... We spent the days of the siege running between the resort and the provincial capital's main government building, a hulking 9-story edifice ringed with palm trees. On the 3rd day of the siege, Shevardnadze convened a press conference. He appealed to his countrymen to come to the aid of the city, saying Georgia was at war with Russia. The entreaty was broadcast over Georgian TV. In response, several hundred tried to come to the front. They flew out from Tbilisi in another Tu-154 passenger jet loaded with ammunition and fighters. But as the jet attempted to land, the Abkhaz shot it down with a heat-seeking missile. The crippled craft broke into several pieces on impact. More than 100 people died, including a journalist from the Wall Street Journal, Alexandra Tuttle. I had met her only once, coincidentally at the very airport where she would meet her death. It had been a few weeks earlier in the summer, ironically when I was arriving in Sukhumi and she was leaving to go back to Tbilisi. Also on board the plane was Alexander Ivanishvili, the 33-year-old brother of my friend and colleague Nino Ivanishvili, a violinist and physicist who had never held a gun in his hands and regarded the war in Abkhazia as a mistake. Alexander and 7 of his friends, one an artist, another a doctor, headed for the front only after hearing Shevardnadze's desperate radio exhortations that Georgia was at war with Russia. Alexander's body was never found amid the wreckage of the burning jet, but unknown charlatans hounded his sister Nino for more than a year after the war ended, saying Alexander was alive and extracting money from her for supposedly arranging for his release. After the con men had their cash, their promises gradually ceased, and Alexander was of course never heard from again. The Georgians coming back from the front were getting pulverized. Thomas Goltz, the war reporter, and I watched one carload pull up to a hospital. One of the soldiers was dead, coated in blood. Part of his head had been blown off. His 3 comrades were sobbing and slapping him in the face, as if trying to wake him. A few minutes later, the Abkhaz rained shells onto the capital again, and smoke rose in velvet plumes into the sunny September air. They managed a direct hit on the TV tower, which had beamed Shevardnadze's exhortations from atop a hill. A few hours later, I saw huge flames coming from the shore near the sanatorium. The howitzer battery had been hit. I thought about what had become of the 2 soot-faced men who had been manning it. Finally, the phone lines with the outside world were cut. I felt a sense of despair mingled with relief. There were no satellite phones, no way left to report. We were alone with the fate of the city. Freed from the demands of conversing with my editors, the next day Goltz and I decided to take a bar of soap into the Black Sea and bathe our filthy bodies. It was an otherwise perfect late summer day, and I thought about the incongruity of a serene swim along the shore of a condemned city under constant bombardment. Suddenly, 2 Georgian Air Force Sukhoi 25 fighter bombers appeared on the horizon. They streaked low and passed almost exactly 90 degrees above our heads. We dunked ourselves underwater, as if that had been any defense use had their bomb doors swung open and dropped one. As we re-emerged for air, I saw the 2 planes race toward Abkhaz positions. There was an earth-shattering blast. Then just 1 plane returned our way and headed back across the sea. I knew that the entire Georgian Air Force had consisted of 4 aging Sukhoi 25 fighter bombers. Now there were 3. After our bath was cut short, I returned to the sanatorium and called the military press center. Although the phone links with the rest of the world had been cut, the phone lines within the city were still intermittently working. With the lack of people left behind to use them, they were working better than ever. It was one of those strange, snickering ironies that one finds amid total chaos. Bits of life still function normally, out of inertia. A Georgian press officer whose voice I recognized picked up the receiver. I asked about the planes that had just streaked over the city with their unmistakable scream. "What planes?" he slurred. He was stone drunk. The wake for the city had begun. Within 2 more days, the Abkhaz closed to within a few hundred meters of the main government building, the mini Reichstag of this empire war. Inside, the food had run out. Shevardnadze convened a final press conference, but it was mostly a rant about the Russians and how they had deceived him. With no one to translate his comments into English, one of Shevardnadze's assistants asked me to interpret for the few remaining journalists. Ed Parker, in attendance out of a sense of history, even though he had no outlet to report to, leaned over. He told me about how he'd been to the airport and seen 100 bodies of those killed when the last plane full of reinforcements had been shot down. "Mate, I've seen more bodies in one day here than in 2 years in Bosnia." His eyes were full of sick excitement. On the 7th floor of the local Supreme Soviet building, the members of the Provisional Georgian government gathered. Those who wanted to flee had already availed themselves of the opportunity. Those staying behind had reconciled themselves to either capture or death. Georgians have a tradition known as datireba, a form of mournful singing performed at funerals. Relatives and loved ones literally cry to the deceased as a type of protest, scolding them for having left them to flail about in the temporal world. They also have a tradition of bacchanalian toasting and drinking, a tradition designed not only to celebrate life's more felicitous moments, but also to paper over the saddest of them. The mood among the government officials was a mixture of all of this. One of the officials, a barrel-chested man, was also a well-known jazz musician. He invited me in, pounded on his desk, shouted and laughed boisterously, poured a glass of cognac, and belted out a loud song. And then there was Alexander Berulava, now vice-commandant of the city. He had given me a ride that first day in Sukhumi a year earlier. He was reviled by the Abkhaz, who accused him of tolerating abuses at the start of the war nobody started. Berulava resented journalists for not taking the Georgian side, as he saw it, in the war. He had been morose for days as the fate of the city hung in the balance. Now, with the end near and only the details of his fate to be decided, he seemed relieved. In fact, he was beaming. He sensed closure. His choice to stay had been made. I tried to understand his fatalism. Outside, the shelling was getting heavy again, and the sun was setting. I got ready to dash the half-mile back to the sanatorium. As I left the building for the last time, Berulava ran after me onto the grounds with something in his hands. For a moment, I thought perhaps he wanted to harangue me. Instead, he clutched a book. It was a collection of essays by Shevardnadze called My Choice for Democracy and Freedom, signed and dedicated personally to Berulava just 2 days before. Dearest Alexander, for your support during the darkest days in Sukhumi, yours truly, Eduard Shevardnadze. He pushed it into my hands. Here, I want you to have this. If I get out alive, you'll return it to me. If I don't, please keep it. It was the last time I would see Alexander Berulava. I still have his book. Back at the sanatorium, the shells pummeled us all night and all of the next day. By now there was no food. Even the battle-hardened Ed Parker was becoming more unhinged, as if that was possible. He, Thomas Goltz, and the marooned relief worker from the French aid group, Médecins Sans Frontières, argued over the ownership of a piece of processed cheese. Parker threatened to disembowel the aid worker. We restrained him, arguing that a Tolstoyan duel over a piece of processed cheese was not worth the trouble. Parker and I walked through the grounds of the sanatorium. A big jeep belonging to the aid worker was parked nearby. The door was emblazoned with a huge emblem reading Médecins Sans Frontières. Parker's eyes lit up. Mate, I've got a great idea. Let's steal that jeep, cut off the top, and rip out the seats. We'll give it to a bunch of drugged-up Georgian fighters and have them bolt an anti-aircraft gun to the floor. Then we'll take pictures of them firing the thing into the air with the emblem Médecins Sans Frontières on the side. We'll publish the photos all over the world. When the Abkhaz get here, they'll hang that aid worker from the lamppost. That night, there was nothing to do but listen to the particularly fierce pounding of artillery. One shell landed in the doorway to our building, shattered the windows, and disfigured a tile mosaic in the yard featuring the face of Soviet Union founder Vladimir Lenin. It was a dramatic night, but I had no way to report any of it. It seemed like time had stopped, existence suspended. It was time to get out of the city. Rumors flew. There would be a plane out. Or a boat. The information spread like wildfire. We waited for a lull in the fighting. When it came, our Ukrainian cameraman from Reuters, Sergei Karazy, and another cameraman and photographer, the Azerbaijani Farkhad Karimov, and I set out on foot for the airport, 15 miles away. 2 years later, Farkhad was executed by a group of Chechen rebels who mistook him for a spy. On the misleadingly peaceful-looking road, there was not a single vehicle. We encountered a few pedestrians hauling sacks, a trickle of humanity headed out of the city. Near a train depot, an artillery shell landed about 30 yards from us. We hit the ground. When we approached the airport, I saw the Tu-134 passenger plane approaching. Slowly it circled and then landed. A mass of fighters and a few civilians rushed in, believing they'd found their ticket out. Faces turned somber when they realized that the craft was going nowhere. As it pulled to the terminal, jet fuel leaked like rain from the wings. From a jerry-rigged gunboat in the harbor, the Abkhaz had peppered the fuel tanks with bullets, puncturing them. Soldiers rushed to and fro with buckets, trying to collect the valuable liquid before it spilled onto the ground. We wandered away from the bucket brigade and the airport. To where? We had no real idea. It was pointless to continue down the coastal road. The Abkhaz had cut it 10 days before. There was no way out. We walked into a village across from the airport road. Most of the houses were deserted. But in front of me, an old woman in a long black dress and headscarf was standing in the yard. A widow. Widows in rural Georgia usually dress in black, no matter how many years have passed after the death of their husbands. They are never invisible. Strangely, the woman was smiling. She invited us in. Her name was Eteri. There was a persimmon tree in the yard, and she went outside and plucked several of the bright orange globes and tucked them into her apron. The inside of the wooden farmhouse was a typical Georgian shrine to her dead husband. It exuded timeless warmth. There was only a repressed sense of worry on her face. She cooked up a meal of chicken and soup, the supra, or Georgian feast, trumping the bleakness of the situation. She fetched some home moonshine, made from tangerines. We drank it copiously, in between her toasts to Georgia, to God, and to her dead husband, who had passed away years previously. I asked her if she planned to try to leave. "Of course not," she said nonchalantly. "The reinforcements will be here soon." We tried to convince her to reconsider. She smiled and refused. I did not have the heart to tell her it was all over. Eteri put a kerosene lamp in a window and poured more of her moonshine. I slept deeply, with the bittersweet taste of fermented tangerines on my lips. In the morning, I peered out a window. The shore was visible. Large naval ships were emerging on the horizon. The Russian and Ukrainian navies had sent boats in to evacuate those who wanted to leave, and that meant just about everybody. I gathered my things and turned to say goodbye to Eteri. "Are you sure you don't want to go with us?" I asked. There was no answer, just a slight smile. "I'll be here," she said. I did not know if this was naivete or a bow to fate. After the war was over, I returned to the area and got close enough to see her house in the distance. The windows and doors were flung open, and a breeze was blowing curtains back and forth. Predictably, the house had been looted. Eteri was gone. A mass of locals moved toward the ships. Many were sobbing. They were coming to terms with the fact that they would never see their homes again. The Georgians were leaving, knowing the Abkhaz would make sure they did, or worse, if they arrived before they fled. They would not be allowed to return, collective punishment for the war. The ships could not move close enough toward the shore. The water was too shallow. Women swam in their flowing dresses toward the waiting boats. And then there were the dogs. They moved in several packs around the area where the ships had pulled up. Labs, huskies, and German shepherds. Mutts and purebreds. Their owners had abandoned them. They yelped, they barked, they ran about excitedly. We waded out to sea with the refugees. We were hoisted on board a boat full of them. We started to pull away. One of the dogs jumped into the water and paddled his way toward the boat. A woman screamed. The captain stopped the craft. We waited, and the dog was hoisted to safety. Then we pulled away from the shore. Across the city of botanical gardens, palms, and pastel-colored buildings, a great many fires now burned out of control. The yelping of the dogs faded to a collective whimper as we moved toward the horizon. They and we were the lucky ones. Hundreds of people walked days through icy high mountain passes, starving. Road bandits of their own ethnicity often stole their belongings as they tried to walk to safety. Dozens froze to death along the way. When we reached the shore on the other side of Poti, we piled onto a bus. We headed toward Tbilisi. In the seat in front of me sat an older man, a rotund man, balding, the type of man you expect to see singing loud Georgian songs and toasting with wine around one of their legendary feasting tables. The man was sobbing uncontrollably. The sound rippled through the bus like a throbbing knife. He kept repeating the same word, Shvilo, Shvilo, meaning son or children in Georgian. It can also be used as a simple exclamation. In this case, it sounded more like a moan. The man glanced at me, quieted, and then burnished an apple with his coat. He turned and handed it to me. "Here," he said. "You remind me of my son." The son had heeded Shevardnadze's call to come to the defense of the city, and he was killed in the war's final days. On the 10th day of the siege, the capital of Abkhazia fell to the Abkhaz, or was liberated in the terminology they used. Shevardnadze escaped. The Georgians had patched up the wings of the plane I had seen, the plane whose fuel tanks had been shot full of holes. I wondered if the son of the man who had given me the apple had been on the same plane with the president, his body in one of those gleaming zinc coffins. A few days after the fall of the city, cameraman Sergei Karazy and I grabbed a plane from Tbilisi to the Russian city of Sochi. We made our way down the Black Sea coast. We crossed the Pasu River back into Abkhazia. A Russian border guard whom I recognized greeted me. Trucks full of looted goods were pulled up to the border between Russia and Abkhazia. Some of the more absurd aspects of the war had unnerved the man. "A couple of days ago, a Polish guy tried to cross the border, saying he wanted to fight for little Abkhazia. I asked him, 'Can you tell the difference between a Georgian and an Abkhaz?' He told me no. They let him through anyway." On the horizon, hundreds of trucks filled the roads. They were stacked high with war loot, carpets, furniture, appliances, somebody else's bric-a-brac. When we got to the capital, looting was in full swing. I walked up to a house where Abkhaz partisans were loading furniture into a truck. They were bickering about what to do with the spoils. I recognized one of the men immediately. He looked more erudite than the rest of the group, mostly rank-and-file fighters on a victory high. He identified himself as a member of the Abkhaz parliament. He acknowledged me, embarrassed. The fighters continued loading their war trophies into the truck unabated. "What you see here is sad, but it is true," he told me. "This is the way of war." And it was. There were elements of this on every side in all the post-Soviet wars I witnessed. Few passed up the chance of looting or taking trophies when given the opportunity. Behind a building near the sanatorium where we'd stayed, I saw two bodies, one of an old woman and another of a middle-aged man. They had been shot. Kerchiefs covered their faces. A monkey stood on a bridge nearby, looking rather confused and evidently pondering his next destination. Monkeys are not native to Abkhazia. He was from a scientific research center full of hundreds of primates nearby. They had been used in medical experiments, and a few had actually been sent into space in the Soviet space program. Georgian troops stole many of them and turned them into pets. They elevated some to war mascot status, riding about in their tanks with the monkeys atop, like slapstick commanders. Now primate conscription had ended, and the monkeys were relishing their newfound freedom. Later, I saw an Abkhaz journalist whom I recognized. He greeted me warmly. Behind us, the Supreme Soviet was charred. Some of those inside had resisted, and the Abkhaz and their allies had set it ablaze after dragging out those last Georgians who had stayed behind. I asked about Alexander Berulava, the man who had given me Shevardnadzi's book to keep for him. "Berulava?" the journalist asked wryly. "Berulava was executed." His death was likely a gruesome one. Both sides, especially during the waning days of the war, had, among other things, taken to chopping off ears from dead adversaries or plucking out eyes, often before they were killed. I saw the preacher man again. He smiled broadly. In his broken Russian, he shouted, "Slava Bogu!" several times. Literally, the term translates as "glory to God," but it is used as an interjection rather than literally, something along the lines of "thank God for that" or "luckily." The preacher man was oblivious to having misused his limited Russian syntax, however. Instead, he kept repeating the phrase, "Slava Bogu! Slava Bogu!" It lilted like a feather in the sultry, smoke-scented air. The Abkhaz journalist turned to me and whispered, "What the hell does he mean by that, Slava Bogu?" "He just means it," I answered. "He just means it." We moved south out of the city on foot, in the direction of the airport. All along the horizon, houses were burning and being looted. Though several days had passed, there were still packs of dogs running aimlessly along the road, searching for their abdicated owners. I swear I recognized some of them. The war that nobody started had ended, at least for now. Buried 5 times. Insurgents in black nylons. Eduard Shevardnadze, the man who ended the Cold War, fled Abkhazia not in a boat or on a freezing mountain pass. He flew out in that same last, ravaged, jet-fueled dripping plane we saw at the Sukhumi airport, its wings full of bullet holes. Workers had patched them with metal strips and scavenged up just enough fuel for a quick escape back into government-controlled territory. Or what was left of it. This latest insurrection was underway even before the war that nobody started ended. Georgia was entering its 4th war in less than 2 years of independence, from the empire's crown jewel to failed state. The protagonist was none other than Zviad Gamsakhurdia, elected president in 1990, but quickly having evoked the ire of many within months, including the artists-turned-warlords Kichigin and Ioseliani. Proclaiming Gamsakhurdia an autocrat and a demagogue, they felt the best way to unseat him was to lug large-caliber artillery pieces into the upper floors of the nearby in-tourist hotel and fire them directly at the parliament from less than 100 yards away. It was an excessive use of firepower, to say the least, like going after ants with a sledgehammer. Done more for the warlord's warped sense of Georgia as vaudeville effect, there were TV crews to show off for, after all, than for anything faintly resembling military logic. After a couple of weeks of blasting away, a once elegant city center was reduced to a series of smoking holes and gutted neoclassical facades. They could indeed boast, at least, of forcing Gamsakhurdia to flee to Chechnya, where he found a fellow traveler in the rebel, rabidly anti-Kremlin leader there, Dzhokhar Dudayev. That did not mean Gamsakhurdia had lost all backing, especially in the countryside or outside Tbilisi. To call them supporters would be an understatement. These were devotees, worshippers of a kind, and Gamsakhurdia was a near deity for many of them. The evocation of this allure seems simple enough on the surface. Zviad was the son of Georgia's most famous 20th century writer, Konstantin Gamsakhurdia. While the Western reader may have never heard of such epics as The Smile of Dionysus, these works have deep resonance in the literature-obsessed Georgian soul. Constantine's bitter criticism of the Bolshevik takeover of Georgia and his exile to an island in the Arctic Ocean, where he came close to suicide before distracting his mind by translating Dante, reinforced his credentials. Zviad was a linguist and ethnographer with an explosive temper and a penchant for rants against ethnic minorities like the Abkhaz. He once said that the Abkhaz should leave Georgia and go back where they came from, embracing a radical claim that the Abkhaz were originally mountain dwellers from outside Georgia who had gradually migrated to the Georgian Black Sea coast. "The Abkhaz nation doesn't exist," he yelled through a megaphone in front of the Georgian parliament during one rally in 1990. Today in Georgia, such statements sound absurd, but in the supercharged ethnic frenzy of the Soviet collapse, they found resonance. Aside from his nationalist creds, important at that time, Zviad's ascension was bolstered by his taking over the mantle of Georgia's leading anti-Soviet dissident. He was tossed, KGB style, into a mental hospital for a spell, further boosting his own standing. Deeper reasons prevailed for the mystic adoration he inspired among his devotees. The surrealism surrounding his death helps illustrate some of them. But Zviad in the autumn of 1993 was far from dead. Shevardnadze's loss of Abkhazia gave him a chance to reclaim power. Wild throngs greeted Gamsak-Hurdia upon his return from exile to western Georgia, his power base. He proclaimed himself president again and, with a few hundred ragged troops, advanced toward the capital, most of the remnants of the government's army having scattered or getting ready to. Alas, he had barely unpacked his bags when Shevardnadze pulled a desperate move. The same man who accused the Russians of engineering his defeat in Abkhazia now invited those same Russian troops to intervene to save his own regime, even greeting them as they docked on the Black Sea coast. In exchange, the man who won the Cold War signed Georgia up to the Russian-led Commonwealth of Independent States, Moscow's pitiful attempt to cobble some loose USSR fragments back together. With the Russians pouring in and his insurgent forces vastly outnumbered, Zviad retreated for a last stand in the western Georgian capital of Zugdidi. We prepared to scramble off to find him before the inevitable occurred, his capture, escape, or death. I lay awake the night before, thinking about the imprudence of trying to gain entrance to yet another besieged city. Wind and rain drummed against Tbilisi's endless maze of galvanized zinc roofs, an electric heater inert at the foot of my bed. The device itself was a thin piece of wire wrapped around a ceramic cylinder, a death trap in a midnight stumble. Happily, a power outage had rendered the thing temporarily impotent, and me freezing. Tbilisi had taken on the kind of atmosphere that often follows humiliating defeats, resigned apathy mixed with an increasing sense of nihilism. Violent young men lurked in the shadows, and you knew it. In the morning, I forced myself out of bed and headed toward our office on Rustaveli Avenue, on the 5th floor of a building with a semi-permanently broken elevator. There I met up with my cameraman, Sergei, to figure out how to get to Zugdidi for Zviad's last stand. There was such a plethora of great bad options. The main road was cut by skirmishes, and the rest of the roads were usually little more than neglected dirt tracks. As we prepared to head out, a group of scruffy paramilitary-looking types, by now simply meaning men with guns, banged on the office door, mistaking it for someone else's. They were headed for the front to do battle with the Zviadists, they explained. One of the men eyed a cheap, poorly produced, and, as it turned out, inaccurate road map of Georgia that I'd taped up on the wall behind my desk. "Where's Samtredia?" he demanded. "Here," I said, pointing to the town in western Georgia of that name. It was along the main highway, supposedly the epicenter of the new war. "Gmedlopt," said the man, thanking me in Georgian, and turned to go. "Just a second," I said, ripping the 50-cent piece of cartography off the wall and thrusting it at him. "Take it." If these government forces had no idea where Samtredia was, they were in far worse shape than we were, but at least might recognize us before they shot, thanks to my map gift. The boys left on their mission, and Sergei and I followed them westward toward the Black Sea and the front lines, a loose designation at best, in our beat-up Russian Niva four-wheel drive. The road was full of potholes, meaning, by the standards of the time, in fairly good shape. We stopped for a meal in the lone functioning canteen in Georgia's second city, Kutaisi, the legendary capital of the ancient kingdom of Colchis. The 11th century Baghrati Cathedral, still in ruins 301 years after Ottoman conquerors blew it up in 1692, talk about a slow repair job, brooded over the city from atop a cliff. Jason and the Argonauts, in their epic quest for the Golden Fleece, had Kutaisi as their final destination, King Aedes' seat of power. The canteen had no seats, so we stood while eating beef stew and large pieces of Georgian tonis puri, bread baked on the sides of an ancient kiln, washing it down with a quirky, unique to Georgia, antifreeze-colored tarragon-flavored soft drink. At 6,400,000 something, the bill sounded steep for some slop and bread, but the currency at the time was the infamous interim Georgian coupons, looking like Xeroxed Monopoly money, and then trading on world currency markets at something like 2 million to the dollar. I'd never given $1 million anything as a tip. I did so, and my mood improved. We continued west along the main road under a light rain. There was no point in continuing on the main highway through Samtredia. It had been conquered and retaken by first the Ziviotists and then the government on almost a daily basis. One day, a few government troops would roll forward with a tank or two, stand around, and pull back when a few dozen Ziviotists, who hadn't fled Shevardnadze's Russian enemies turned allies, would roll in. The next day, the reverse would happen. Rather than endure such theatrics, we chose a route marked yellow on our map, designating a secondary road, supposedly in reasonably good condition, that would bring us across the lines. Instead, we found a wide, formerly asphalted rut leading through a forest. Places of war need not be tormentingly depressing, although many, if not most, are. Yet in much of western Georgia, it was hard to believe any conflict was going on at all. Streams of gentle autumn light poked through the lush subtropical foliage. Palms whispered in the breeze. In tiny villages, women in straw hats sold sunflower seeds wrapped in pages ripped out of discarded editions of Gogol. Cows meandered amid tea plantations. As we admired the landscape, 3 more scraggly Kalashnikov-toting men, God knows fighting for whom, flagged down our car. They were proud Ziviotists, they explained, but on the run in the face of the Russian intervention. "That fucking Shevardnadze," one said. "He lets the Russians take Sukhumi, and then he brings them in to do the dirty work. He is nothing but an occupier and a KGB agent." "Turn down that road," one said, pointing to another muddy track with bits of asphalt remaining here and there. We didn't argue. Within 5 minutes, we hit a water-covered rut with such force that the speedometer console fell out onto my lap. I argued with the gunmen about where the hell they were taking us. Another 5 minutes later, the trio hopped out at an intersection, expressing no remorse for the assorted gauges now adorning my lap. I ripped out the wires and tossed them in the back of the car. Our relief in reaching Zugdidi, Gamsak Hurdia's last stand fortress, was short-lived. No one was really in control of the Ziviotist capital. A panicky gathering milled around the local administration building, speculating about the Russians being on the way or trading rumors. We deferentially checked in to see if we needed some sort of accreditation from the authorities. Instead, we found only a room full of officials chattering away. One wrote down our names. Accreditations? No, we don't have any of those, he said. We asked for a meeting with President Gamsakhurdia. Loud assurances were given that he was on his way. When? Soon. Where? Right here, over there, at the stadium, in the central square. Gamsakhurdia was trapped. Confusion reigned. Some of his fighters were driving up and down the main street in a stolen Red Cross four-wheel drive, aimlessly, an act of final defiance. The sight of the vehicle, jammed with paramilitaries, Kalashnikovs pointing out the windows, fit the mood perfectly because the more delirious Zviadists were convinced the International Red Cross was an intelligence front. We crossed the street to a building where we were told we could find a man by the name of Jambul, Zviad's self-described chief of security. We found him, but the man was so drunk that he was swaggering as he stood. "The president is not available," Jambul said gravely. Suddenly shooting began outside the building. We were convinced the government had decided to storm the city. We hit the floor, but the crackle of Kalashnikovs ceased abruptly after a minute. We emerged from the building. A warlord by the name of Vakhtang Loti, meaning the drunken Georgian, Kobelev had arrived. The volley of gunfire was a celebratory greeting. Kobelev's nickname was said to be fitting. The root of his surname was equally ironic. Kobelev means bread in Megrelian, the local Georgian dialect used in the area, and Kobelev had indeed been a bread truck driver in Soviet times before launching his paramilitary career. Vakhtang, the drunk, had fought on Zviad's side during the First Civil War, running the Megrelia area as a kind of fiefdom and a safe haven for supporters of the ousted Gamsakhurdia government before making some sort of peace with Shevardnadze. But Kobelev's detractors said Kobelev's forces fought half-heartedly in order to ensure Shevardnadze's defeat in the final days of the war in Abkhazia, ultimately switching back to Gamsakhurdia's side just in time for his last stand. I again asked Jambul about Gamsakhurdia's whereabouts. "That's a state secret," he said, as if Gamsakhurdia actually controlled a county, let alone a country. There was no chance of an interview, he said. "It's getting dark. I'd advise you to get out of here, for your own safety." Drunken security chiefs not being known for caution, we promptly obliged and headed down a back road again toward Tbilisi, becoming completely lost in a worsening downpour. Two men stood near an intersection, both of them brandishing Kalashnikovs. Sergei decided to ask them for directions. Not a good idea, it turned out. The two were agitated and demanded to see our documents. We assumed they were Zviadists, so we tried to get in their good graces by emphasizing that we had just come from Zugdidi, where we had met with members of his government. "We're Zviadists, all right," growled one of the pair, "but we could drink his blood tomorrow if we want." Loyalties were breaking down, and the conversation soon grew from uncomfortable to threatening. I was ordered by the gunman on my side of the car to empty my wallet. It contained $140, but I was not particularly upset, because it could have been much worse. I had $5,000 stashed in a duffel bag in the back of the Jeep, having made a cash run to Reuters in Moscow a few days earlier and forgotten I'd stashed away the money. Happily, the thugs weren't very thorough with their shakedown. Then came the subject of our TV camera, which Sergei was holding in his lap. It was a Sony professional unit and worth $10,000. The gunman on the passenger side grabbed the lens and began pulling the camera away. Sergei tugged back, an act of audacity that startled the gunman. "Look," the one on the left explained, "we could kill you right here and toss you in a ditch to die," he raged. "Give us the fucking camera." The tug-of-war resumed. Sagely, Sergei appealed to the men's sense of masculine honor, a holdover from better times before their homeland and Georgian way of life were ravaged by poverty and upheaval. "Please understand," reasoned Sergei. "If you take this camera, which is of no use to you, He will deprive me of my livelihood. I have hungry mouths to feed at home. I won't even be able to buy bread for my children." Suddenly, along this muddy, rainy road in the middle of a forest, where the thieves had no reason not to strip us of everything we owned, time stood still. The gunman went silent. Sergei had uttered the magical words, "Children, bread." These were brutal days, creeds, rules, and laws eroding quickly. Yet the storied sense of Georgian respect for guests and the country's cult of the sacredness of the child still held sway. The gunman released his grip on the lens, his hand slipping away as if greased, leaving Sergei with the camera and the man with the gun and the power to exterminate us, slowly closed the car door himself. We returned without our interview. In fact, Gamsakhurdia never gave another one, melting instead into the hills and gorges to ponder the last days of his life. Within a few weeks, on New Year's Eve of 1994, the end came. A single shot from a pistol penetrated the side of Zviad Gamsakhurdia's head. The venue was a farmhouse amid a nondescript village in western Georgia, far from presidential glory in Tbilisi. The government claimed it was a suicide. His devoted followers shouted murder. Gamsakhurdia was dead, but a decade-and-a-half epic had been born, the story of his wandering corpse and the unclear circumstances of his demise. At first, Gamsakhurdia's resting place next to a farmhouse is kept secret, a select few performing the burial. Then he is dug up a second time and moved again, just in case a mole had leaked the location. Zviad's supporters, however, see the lack of a body as proof that he is alive. He is not dead, they insist. All such reports are merely propaganda. Then, in late February, a Chechen plane lands in western Georgia on a special mission. Gamsakhurdia's volatile widow, Manana, refused to let his corpse rest in the junta-dominated Georgia of Shevardnadze, as Zviad's supporters called Shevardnadze's government. A Georgian delegation meets the Chechens, and together they fly by helicopter to the obscure village where Zviad is buried. There, men with simple shovels dig clinically, deliberately. Their expressions bear neither gravity nor sorrow. The process is not a long one. A simple handmade wooden coffin emerges, the type that a typical villager might be entombed in. The men hastily carry it off to the waiting helicopter. Stalks of straw from the farmhouses fly about as the whirl of the blades carries the coffin into the sky. A biting cold envelops those of us assembled along the tarmac as we wait for the flying hearse to land. But once the wooden coffin is unloaded, the Chechens who came to fetch Gamsakhurdia's remains look startled. They evidently assume the dead president had been buried Muslim style without a casket. The Chechens have brought along their own zinc coffin in which to transport him to Grozny. An eerie spectacle ensues. The presence of the empty zinc coffin is a bad omen in Chechen culture, we are told. Removing the empty box from their plane, the Chechens place it in the center of their runway. A large truck belching blue smoke arrives, and the Chechens proceed to drive it over the zinc box, over and over, until nothing remains but a mangled hunk of twisted metal, evidently satisfied that the lurking evil spirits inhabiting it are now destroyed. Next begins the haggling between the Georgian government delegation and the Chechen undertakers over what to do with Gamsakhurdia's coffin. The Chechens, led by their vice president, Zelimkhan Yandarbiev, insist it be immediately loaded onto his plane and flown back to Grozny. The Georgians insist on verifying, unscientifically, that it is actually Gamsakhurdia lying inside. The Chechens resist, saying opening it would be sacrilege. One of the Georgians responds by pointing out that Gamsakhurdia was an Orthodox Christian, not a Muslim Chechen. The Georgians refuse to allow the coffin to be loaded onto the plane. Zviad Gamsakhurdia's corpse, now almost an afterthought, lying in the middle of the cracked asphalt runway as the officials argue. The Chechens finally relent and agree to a brief opening of the coffin for verification. Several of us crowd around it, its pale wood now damp and earthen-colored after almost 2 months in the winter ground. There is something of a morbid anxiousness to it all. The Georgians begin carefully prying the cover off with chisels, and slowly the lid slides open. Without formaldehyde or other embalming agents, biological processes have taken their course. Zviad is gaunt, but although I am meeting him for the first time, there is no doubt it is Gamsakhurdia, his unique, chiseled facial features still unmistakable. He is dressed in a black and white suit, his simple dark tie blotched with specks of green. Perhaps most curiously of all, the ousted president wears no shoes. This elicits rumors of all fashions, noteworthy among them that Gamsakhurdia, an Orthodox Christian, converted to Islam before his death, which makes no sense. Had he converted to Islam, he would have been buried in a shroud, not a coffin. A Georgian official lowers his head toward Gamsakhurdia's, like a man checking a diamond for authenticity, and squints. It's the bullet hole he's interested in. Indeed, it is there, on the right side of the president's head, partially obscured by some sort of mold, but still clearly visible. The viewing is over within a minute or two. The Georgians put the lid back on, as if putting the cover back on a tub of margarine. The corpse takes off into the sky. In Grozny, there was a splendid state funeral for Gamsakhurdia. He was then interred in the garden of the stately Chechen guest mansion where he had spent a year in exile. A white stallion led the cortege, which was wholly appropriate because the white horse is linked with Persian and Zoroastrian mythology and was a constant in the Zviadist iconography of light against darkness and good against evil. After his 1992 ouster in Tbilisi, no fewer than 20,000 of his supporters marched along a riverbank, a woman riding such a steed, and those devotees who refused to believe in his indisputable death continued to insist he would return one day, of course atop a white stallion. I have already described his pedigree, the son of Georgia's most famous writer and philosopher, his acts of anti-Soviet defiance, and his explosive personality, all of which earned Zviad Gamsakhurdia his credibility as national savior to be. Zviad's vision of Georgia's unique role in the world certainly played a role in his mystique. His supporters peddled a pamphlet called The Spiritual Mission of the Georgian Nation. It was based on an erudite, obscurantist 1990 speech Zviad gave at Tbilisi's Philharmonic Hall, in which it was suggested that Georgia was meant by God to serve as a link between Occident and Orient, thus fulfilling its supposedly unique destiny. But there are other reasons, far more intoxicating, for the often maniacal degree of devotion one found among Zviad's hardcore supporters. Again, a disproportionate number of them middle-aged and older women, spinsters in a land where ordinary outlets of passion were greatly constrained at the time, a psychosexual appeal, a surrogate for unrealized desires. Zviad's sometimes reserved, sometimes bombastic, enigmatic personality, prone to seeing provocations and blackmail, added to the mystique. For many years after his death, on Zviad's birthday or that of his literary giant late father, large crowds of those devotees, these insurgents who believe in Zviad's return or resurrection, gathered at the Gamsakhurdia family compound, a very large brick home in the center of Tbilisi. Often there were well over 1,000 of them. They marched along the narrow streets, pushing and shoving to get closer to the shrine. Again, most were women, disproportionately middle-aged and older, dressed in black and slightly frumpy, flat black simple nylons. So ubiquitous are the nylon wearers that the dead Gamsakhurdia's army of female devotees are known as the Shavi Kolgotebi, the black stockings. A man in wire-rimmed glasses rants through a megaphone about what they called the junta, Shevardnadze, running Georgia, and about Gamsakhurdia, who many here still insist is alive, one day to return on that white horse. Some of the black stockings appear to be in a trance-like state, eyes fixated on the podium, hands clutching umbrellas used as parasols to parry a searing sun. Listening intently, one of the women teeters, Her eyeballs roll back in her head briefly, facial muscles twitching and then relaxing, eyes becoming placid again. Orgasm, or the cusp of one. But why here? Why Gamsakhurdia? Why Georgia? The corset of Oriental love rights applied here, stoked no doubt by centuries under Persian and Ottoman rule. Westerners knew little about the complexities of Soviet-Russian sexual mores. We were hoodwinked by the prudish facade of communism. But those who spent significant time in Moscow or Leningrad knew firsthand about the hedonism and promiscuity afoot. It was not for nothing that late Imperial Russia's ladies of the court equated copulation with Rasputin as communion with the Almighty, or that Soviet theoreticians in the 1920s propagated that sex was a drink of water. These notions found fertile soil. And if Soviet Russia was difficult to understand, Georgia's erotic essence was practically unfathomable to the outsider. Here was the confluence of Occident and Orient, patriarchic mores, and mountaineer traditions. Even during Soviet times, this included bride stealing, meaning simply gathering a favored female off the street and keeping her away from her family for a night. Even if there is no physical contact, the night away can technically negate her virginity, virtually ensuring marriage to the wife rustler. The practice continued many years after the Soviet collapse and was not technically made illegal until the early 2000s. Chained libido, political repression, virginity, said Ika, an artist, explaining the deity like erotic Ziviatist phenomenon. She pronounced virginity using the Russian word desvenost, as if it were a profanity. For Ika was an exception, a maximalist, one of the few who embraced her sexuality openly. She illustrated the Georgian tendency to excess by pointing to the scores of people who preferred to dart in between speeding cars along Tbilisi's main Rustaveli Avenue, as if getting a thrill from nearly being mowed down, rather than walk a few yards to use a nice, safe underground walkway. Ika was definitely an exception. Or was she? When I first arrived in Georgia to live in 1992, the Oriental Persian Ottoman influenced mores meant that young women should avoid accidental eye contact with a man, often by quickly turning away, as if avoiding a sin. My first cameraman for Reuters, Gigi Midivani, one day noticed me observing young women as we drove down Rustaveli in his very used Opel. There was no doubt I was looking at a physical interest, but there was also pure aesthetics involved. At the time, many Georgian women dressed extremely well, often in elegant hand-tailored dresses from good quality cloth. It was a stark contrast to the cheap-looking, acid-washed, East German-inspired jeans I often saw in places like Moscow. Cleavage, however, unlike in Russia, was a big no-no. "You spend too much time looking at our women," scolded Gigi. "You can't look at them like that." "Why not?" I asked. "I'm just looking." "We are Asiatics," replied Gigi, putting a halt to the conversation, but not my gawking from the open window of the Opel. "Our women are not like Russian women," he said with a sneer. Gigi pointed to the ruins of the Intourist Hotel on Rustaveli Avenue, then gutted and blackened after the war that had driven Gamsakhurdia from power a few months earlier. "You see that hotel? In the Soviet period, all summer it was full of Russian women. They came here, and our men surrounded them with attention. Flowers, wine, feasts. It was a story I came to hear often. Legions of relatively well-off married Russian women were known to frequent Georgia for a requisite week or two flings in the subtropical summer. Outwardly more libertine than their Georgian sisters, the Russians came for an early version of female sex tourism. Georgian women would not have been caught dead alone in the lobby of the Intourist Hotel without a male escort or brother, as Georgians referred to any male cousin or even distant relative. The freewheeling Russian women used Georgia as a place for guaranteed action. Georgian men were legendary for their chivalry, but casual dalliances with Georgian women were almost unheard of. Well, at least they went unreported. A trip to Georgia for middle-aged Russian women indeed meant wine, bouquets, and endless Georgian feasts known as the Supra, countless compliments, and, of course, furtive sex. The Russian ladies went home north happy. The Georgian men wore their conquests as feathers in their caps. It was the perfect combination, at least for the Georgian males and Russian females. If the Georgians had wives, the infidelity was expected to be accepted, grudgingly or not. There was no doubt that Gigi's proclamation of Georgian female chastity carried some truth. Brides were indeed expected to be virgins, or at least be known as virgins, at marriage. Of course, this would have been the case in the United States or many other Western countries just a half-century prior as well. There were whispers about the doctors who did gekurva, literally sewing up. In other words, hymen restoration. The doctors expert in this art fulfilled an important function, no doubt. Not only did they do repair jobs, enabling new husbands to rest easy after their wedding nights, they also issued post-exam certificates testifying that a woman was a virgin, to ensure that her groom-to-be would not return her after the nuptials like an ill-fitting pair of shoes. This avoided not only scandalous embarrassment, but relegation to the purgatory of permanent spinsterhood. I searched for such a doctor. After considerable giggles and hesitation, my assistant Nino found me just such a physician. "She's willing to talk to you, but only on the condition of anonymity," whispered Nino. Even then, the conversation was an elliptical one, with the doctor describing her work in the third person. It was obvious that she was the one doing the sewing, but technically the practice was illegal, I was told. So shrouded in semi-exaggerated secrecy was my visit that I agreed not to even ask the name of the doctor. I had prepared, on Nino's advice, warm-up questions on broader medical issues. Of course, the doctor, whose name I never did learn, knew what I was there for. After the requisite mutually understood bluffs, we got down to business. "It is extremely delicate work, a jeweler's craft," she softly told me, without even admitting directly that she was one of 4 doctors in our city who are real experts. Her eyes lit up with the pride of an eagle, with the mystery of a shaman. "You must understand, it is not like taking out an appendix. Es saviliro samushawa, a jeweler's craft." Less admirable defilers of her craft, in it only for the money, she said, prefer simply to issue bogus virgin certificates. "Quacks," she lamented. Even so, said the mystery hymen doctor, this was of social benefit. A young girl could be scarred for life with the stigma of a harlot for not producing blood or pain for her new husband. "Of course, our men are too backwards to understand that the hymen can be broken by non-sexual means as well." I was gratified to hear her note this basic medical reality, which would not have been acknowledged by quite so many people a half-century ago in the United States either. The virgin doctors were a viable recourse for those having encountered premarital sex, but so male-dominated was the social scene that many young women I managed to talk to about the situation were convinced that Tbilisi's legendary gossip machine meant they could not risk any perceived impropriety. "I don't want to, but I have to be," said a doe-eyed acquaintance, Lika, of her virginity, still intact at age 26. "If I am not a virgin at marriage, no man will have me. My parents will be forever shamed." "But they don't have to know," I replied, "unless you tell them." "You don't understand. They will just know," sighed Lika. "There is a general saying that if 2 people know a secret, everyone knows. Here in Tbilisi, we say if 1 person knows a secret, everyone knows." As such, it was nothing to hear of 30-something, 40-something, even 50-something virgins. Hence the widespread theory about pent-up erotic passions, Zviag-Gamsakhurdia, and the black stockings. There were, of course, the sexual miscreants, but they fell into 2 broad categories. If they were Georgian and unmarried, the women were branded as sluts. If they were ethnic minorities, say local Jews or Armenians or Slavs, then they were given a green light to mess around. Divorce was the other way to sexual freedom. One friend, Medea, said that at age 19, she married a guy as just such a path to liberty. It lasted 6 months, she said, and then I was free. There is no stigma for divorced women who want to have liberty, to sleep with whom they want. I know lots of girls who got married and then divorced just so they can have sex. And then there were those young women who simply shunned all the rules and regulations, like Ika. At nearly 6 feet tall, stunning, and often clad in sheer black dresses, she was unmistakable passing down Rustaveli Avenue. When Ika described the Georgian tendency toward maximalism, she was, of course, describing herself. A talented young painter, she did nothing to less than excess. At the ripe age of 11, she addictively read and reread Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita, like my Leningrad extortionist buddy Vova and just about everyone else in the former USSR. Instead of doing a few illustrations based on scenes in the book, she painted in excess of 150. The problem here is that young men don't understand that some of us really want to explore. They assume all we want is a husband. Our problem is that we have been at war too long, she said, trying to explain what she considered the Georgian approach toward love and intimate relationships. When she meant war, Ika meant not only the 4 wars in 4 years that Georgia had endured, 2 wars with ethnic overtones and 2 short but brutal civil wars, but hundreds of years of being tossed around between different empires: Greeks, Mongols, Ottomans, Persians, Russians. So love is war, a matter of survival, of cunning. For instance, if a woman is single, she will play the coquette, putting her virginal qualities at the forefront. If the girl is married, she will taunt her prey, demonstratively but delicately playing with her wedding ring, slowly sliding it up and down her finger. She will torture the prey through temptation. The general state of anarchy in Georgia meant increasingly frayed psyches. Extreme behavior was the norm. Even in the mid-1990s, armed paramilitaries still roamed the streets with grenade launchers and AKs. At the entrance to Georgia's Parliament Hall, there is a sign with a pistol with a red slash through it and a written note asking deputies to check their guns at the door. Hard drug use among men skyrocketed, becoming so endemic that even the teetotaler president Eduard Shevardnadze announced that all parliamentary deputies would be scanned for possible narcotics use. Shevardnadze proudly announced on national radio during his weekly address that he had been the first to submit his urine for analysis. The disorder did have another side. A nascent, barely noticeable sexual revolution started to take root. One bar, called Kazbegi, after one of the country's highest mountains, was a hotspot for quick encounters. Our tape editor at Reuters, David, bragged to me that so many condoms had been tossed into the toilets there that the plumbing had to be completely ripped out and replaced. To him, this was a sign of progress. Shevardnadze had other ideas. During another radio address, he noted that many parents had called to complain about the bar as a den of sin. The bar was eventually closed down under unclear circumstances. 50 meters from my house, a brave soul opened Georgia's first sex shop. A sandwich board advertised sex toys, vibrators, artificial phalli. A gang with guns, ergo the police, came and ordered the innovative enterprise closed within a week or so. Guns and hard drugs were okay, but there were evident limits to the science of disorder as a method of governance. From Ika, I got occasional cognac-induced telephone calls. It was clear she was rotting amid Georgia's chaos and still Oriental ways. At last, she elected to vote with her feet. She joined the flood of those leaving the country, ending up in France, where she finally flourished. Georgians, unlike their neighbors the Armenians, never had much of a diaspora. Perhaps it was because of the country's beauty and the traditional ties to the land. But for Georgians, it is very difficult to live abroad, one friend told me. By the late 1990s, the government announced that 1 million people, or nearly 1 in 5 of the entire Georgian population, had left, seeking better futures elsewhere and the uncertainty behind. Given the general mayhem, Few had time to wonder what had become of Gamsakhurdia's grave. I was one, another was Thomas Goltz, my writer friend whom I had met in Sukhumi in 1993. Now it was April 1995, and we were in Chechnya, determined to find Zviad, or what remained of his grave. We set out in search of the mansion. It had been located in the very heart of Grozny, but that area now resembled a torn-up football field rather than a city. Parts of walls or half-intact walls stood here and there, and orientation was difficult. Finally, we located the remains of the mansion. A scorched outside wall of the building was still standing, but the inside was gutted and looted. Was this really the place? Then there among the rubble we found it, a headstone, half blown away by bomb shrapnel, but with an epitaph written in Chechen and Georgian. However, it turned out that Zviad's corpse had moved on again, before our discovery and visitation. Suspecting Russian troops might desecrate the site, a group of Chechens and Georgians spirited his corpse a few hundred meters away to a secret location and buried him again. War washed over Chechnya, receded in 1996, and then rolled over that sad land again in 1999. Years passed before most people thought about Gamsakhurdia's resting place. It was not until 2006 that Russian troops in Chechnya announced they had found the whereabouts of his secret grave. Once again his corpse was exhumed and, at the insistence of his family members, whisked off to a Russian laboratory for a post-mortem, more than 10 years after his death. Meanwhile, back in Tbilisi, the passage of time had brought in changes. In 2003, a brash young former minister in Shevardnadze's government had gone into opposition, calling election results corrupt and demanding Shevardnadze's resignation. The brash young man, of course, was Mikhail Saakashvili, and the movement he had led to depose Shevardnadze became known as the Rose Revolution. In an act of national reconciliation, and to finally get beyond the hot and cold state of civil war that had existed virtually from the time of Georgian independence in 1991, President Mikhail Saakashvili called on Russia to send Zviad back to Georgia so that he could be reburied on Mitasminda Mountain, a sacred area near a cathedral in Tbilisi. Tens of thousands of mourners marched in the procession for this, the fifth burial of Georgia's first president. A word about war. I never planned to become a war correspondent. I'm not even sure I knew what one was. There are no war reporter schools. There are reporters who cover places that happen to be strewn with conflagrations. I was one of those. There are, of course, those who choose the designation willfully and with alacrity, for many reasons, ranging from a sense of duty to inform the world of the latest massacre, injustice, or other outrage, to the addictive high from that first rush of adrenaline after narrowly missing being hit by a tank round. As I said, my inclusion into the profession was not premeditated and can be traced to a first bloody dust-up in ex-Soviet Moldova, early 1992, pitting the pro-Romanian government forces against the Slavic pro-Soviet separatists of the Transnistria Republic. Mission completed, my editor deduced, incorrectly, that I had an inborn proclivity for covering wars and whatever human stupidity accompanied them. Given this set of qualifications, I was sent on to Georgia for the next round of bloodletting, then back to Russia, where ethnic Ossetians, aided and armed by the Russian army, and Muslim Ingush died by the hundreds in a nonsensical week-long melee over a piece of Ingush territory Stalin had given to the Ossetians, who as Orthodox Christians were naturally Russian allies. This all happened by chance or pure stupidity. I was asked to go, and I agreed to do the job. Then it was back to Georgia, and a host of other places, for more. Slowly, covering wars or bloody conflicts becomes completely normal, or one convinces oneself of this, that one can always stop, always leave, go back to whatever one was doing before this, no consequences to mind, spirit, or health. By the spring of 1993, I was supposed to be making plans to leave Georgia and to return to Moscow. That was the agreement, actually, but my editor would have none of it. for I had in his estimation somehow now qualified as a war correspondent. I was not going anywhere soon, except to the next post-Soviet dust-up, and amid the Empire's ashes there were any number to choose from. And that is the end of Part 2, Georgia, Anarchy in Paradise. Thank you for listening to the Workers' Reading Room, and I'll leave you tonight with a Georgian song called Geleno, Bride. Good night.
Dedam tili, deda sa